The Texas sun bled into the horizon as George stared at the glowing screen of the obsolete monitor. The silence of the ranch broken only by the hum of a machine that held a ghost from 30 years ago. The heat of the day was finally beginning to lift from the rolling hills of the ranch just outside of San Antonio. It was that specific time of evening that George Strait loved the most, the golden hour when the mesquite trees cast long, stretching shadows across the dry earth, and the sky turned a bruised purple before fading into the deep indigo of night. Usually, at this hour, he would be out on the porch with a glass of iced tea, watching the cattle graze in the distance, listening to the wind rustle through the live oaks, feeling the immense peace that came with a life well lived. But tonight was different. Tonight, the king of country was not looking at the land he loved. He was sitting in a dusty storage room in the back of the main house, surrounded by cardboard boxes labeled with years that felt like lifetimes ago. George had decided earlier that week that it was time to do some spring cleaning, even though it was mid-autumn. The storage room had become a museum of obsolete technology and forgotten paperwork. There were stacks of set lists from the 90s, old boots that had walked stages from Cheyenne to Houston, and in the corner, sitting on a sturdy oak desk that had seen better days, was a computer tower the color of old parchment. It was a bulky machine, a relic from the mid-90s, the kind that made a grinding noise when it thought too hard. George had intended to simply pull the hard drive and send the machine to the recycling center in town. He was a private man, and the idea of leaving any digital footprint, no matter how ancient, in a landfill for a stranger to find did not sit well with him. He had plugged it in, half expecting the power supply to pop and smoke, but with a groan of fans and the high-pitched whine of a spinning disc, the machine had come to life. The screen flickered, the colors washed out and grainy, displaying a desktop background of a rodeo clown he didn't remember saving. He sat in the creaking office chair, the leather worn smooth, and watched the hourglass cursor turn. His hand, large and weathered from years of roping and strumming, hovered over the mouse. He wasn't looking for anything in particular. He just wanted to make sure there were no personal financial documents or family photos before he wiped it clean. He clicked through the folders. My documents contained nothing but a few letter templates and a recipe for peach cobbler that Norma must have typed up. He smiled at that. Norma, the anchor of his life. She was probably in the kitchen right now preparing dinner, completely unaware that he was traveling back in time in the back room. He navigated to the email client, an old version of Outlook that looked primitive by today's standards. It was set up for an account they hadn't used in 20 years. The inbox was empty, likely cleared out decades ago. The sent folder contained mundane correspondence with contractors about fence repairs and hay deliveries. George moved the cursor to the drafts folder. He didn't know why. It was instinct, perhaps, or maybe just the thoroughness of a man who checked every cinch before a ride. There was one item, just one. The date stood out first, October 14th, 1995. George leaned in, squinting slightly. 1995. That year was a blur of motion. It was the year of the Straight Out of the Box box set, a monumental time in his career. He was touring heavily, breaking records, moving from city to city in a whirlwind of diesel fumes, stage lights, and roaring crowds. He remembered the adrenaline. He remembered the exhaustion. But looking at that date, he tried to remember where he was. Was it Dallas? Was it Nashville? He couldn't place the specific day, but he knew the feeling of that era. It was the feeling of being on top of the world. The subject line of the email made his breath catch in his throat. It wasn't a business memo. It wasn't a recipe. Subject, "If I'm not here when the tour ends." The room suddenly felt very small. The air conditioner kicked on with a rattle, but George didn't hear it. The silence of the Texas evening outside seemed to press against the window pane, heavy and suffocating. He stared at those words, "If I'm not here." His heart, usually a steady rhythm that had kept time for millions of fans, skipped a beat. He felt a cold prickle of sweat on the back of his neck. His finger trembled as he double-clicked the message. The window popped up, white text on a gray background. It wasn't addressed to a lawyer or a friend, it was addressed to him, but it had never been sent. "My dearest George," the text began. He sat back, taking a moment. He needed to prepare himself. He looked around the room, trying to ground himself in the present. He saw the dust motes dancing in the shaft of light coming through the blinds. He saw a trophy on the shelf, a Golden Pick Award. He was George Strait, the man who sang about heartache and loss, but he had always been the storyteller, the observer. He wasn't used to the ground shifting beneath his own feet. He took a deep breath, the smell of old paper and dust filling his lungs, and began to read. "My dearest George, I am writing this because I am a coward. I am writing this because I cannot look into your eyes and tell you what is happening to me. Not now, not when you are shining so bright. You called me last night from the hotel in Tulsa, and you sounded so happy. You told me about the crowd, how they sang every word of check yes or no, and I could hear the life in your voice. I haven't heard you that happy in a long time. I cannot be the one to take that away from you." George stopped. He remembered Tulsa. He remembered that call. He had been sitting on the edge of the hotel bed, adrenaline still coursing through his veins, the receiver pressed to his ear. He remembered Norma sounding quiet. He had asked her if everything was all right, if Bubba was doing his homework, if the horses were okay. She had said yes. She had said she was just tired. He had believed her. Why wouldn't he? She was Norma. She was the rock. She was the one who handled everything so he could be George Strait. He looked back at the screen. "I found a lump, George. It's not small. It's been there for a few weeks, but I pretended it wasn't. I told myself it was just a muscle knot, or maybe nothing at all. But it hasn't gone away. It's gotten harder. I went to see Dr. Evans in San Antonio 3 days ago. I didn't tell you because you were preparing for the Houston shows, and I know how much pressure you are under with the new album release coming up. I sat in that waiting room, George, and I felt so small. Everyone was reading magazines, and there was a woman crying in the corner, and I just kept thinking about you on that stage, under those lights, making people happy. If I told you, you would come home. I know you. You would cancel the tour. You would drop the microphone and drive all night to get here." George's hand came up to cover his mouth. Tears, hot and sudden, stung his eyes. She was right. He would have. He would have burned the contracts, paid the fines, and driven the bus into the ground to get to her side. The thought that she sat in a waiting room alone, terrified, while he was basking in applause, made him feel a nausea so deep it twisted his gut. He felt a wave of shame wash over him, hot and prickly. "Dr. Evans is worried. He didn't say the word, but I saw it in his eyes. He ordered a biopsy. I'm waiting for the results. They said it would take a week. A week, George. It feels like a lifetime. I'm writing this because I'm scared. I'm more scared than I've ever been in my life. I look at the calendar and I count the days until you come home, and I pray that I'm still the same woman you left. But if I'm not, if the news is bad, I need you to know why I didn't speak. I didn't want to be the shadow over your son. You have worked so hard for this moment. This year, this tour, it's everything you've built." George stood up. He couldn't sit anymore. He paced the small room, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. He walked to the window and looked out. The sun was gone now. leaving only a faint orange glow on the horizon. The ranch was settling into the night. He could see the lights of the main house, the warm yellow glow from the kitchen window. Norma was in there. She was alive. She was healthy. She was safe. But 30 years ago, she had been writing this letter, believing she might be dying, and she had chosen to face that darkness alone to protect his dream. He felt a physical ache in his chest, a tightness that had nothing to do with age. He thought he knew everything about her. They had been together since high school. They had eloped in Mexico. They had lost a child together. They had built an empire. He thought there were no secrets between them. But here was a secret so large, so heavy, it threatened to crush the memories he held dear of that golden year. He returned to the chair, forcing himself to read the rest. I need you to promise me something, even though you can't hear me right now. If the worst happens, if this is the cancer that takes me, don't let the music stop. Don't let the ranch go quiet. Bubba needs you to be strong. I need you to be strong. I am saving this in the drafts because I can't bring myself to send it. Maybe tomorrow the doctor will call and say it was all a mistake. Maybe I will delete this and we will laugh about it when we are old and gray. But tonight, the house is so quiet, George. The wind is howling through the eaves. And I feel very far away from you. I love you more than I love my own life. That is why I am silent. That is why I am waiting. Yours always, Norma. The cursor blinked at the end of the text. Blink, 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 like a heartbeat. George sat there for a long time, the screen burning into his retinas. He tried to reconstruct October 1995. He closed his eyes and let the memory wash over him. He remembered coming home after that leg of the tour. He remembered walking through the front door, dropping his bags, and calling out her name. She had come down the stairs. She had looked thin? Had she looked pale? He tried to visualize her face. In his memory, she was smiling. She had hugged him tight, tighter than usual maybe. She had held him for a long time in the hallway. He had asked, "Everything okay, honey?" And she had said, "It is now." He hadn't understood the weight of those 3 words. It is now. He thought she just meant she missed him. He hadn't known that she was holding the result of a biopsy, or perhaps waiting for one, or perhaps she had just received news that allowed her to breathe again. He didn't know. And that was the knife in his heart. He didn't know. He looked at the date again, October 14th. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket, his hands shaking slightly. He searched for George Strait tour dates 1995. He needed to know exactly where he was. The results loaded slowly on the rural signal. October 13, 1995, Tulsa, Oklahoma. October 14, 1995, Little Rock, Arkansas. October 15, 1995, Memphis, Tennessee. He was in Little Rock. He remembered that show. It was at the Barton Coliseum. The acoustics were terrible during sound check. He had been frustrated. He had been snapping at the sound engineer about the monitor mix. He had spent the afternoon worrying about feedback frequencies in the setlist order. While he was worrying about a guitar amp, Norma was sitting at this very computer, or one like it, typing a letter to say goodbye in case she died. The contrast between his trivial frustrations and her existential terror was unbearable. He felt a sudden surge of anger at himself. How could he have been so blind? How could he not have felt it through the phone line? They were supposed to be soulmates. They were supposed to be connected by a cord that stretched across miles. But he had been deaf to her silence. He looked at the delete button on the screen. He could delete it. He could wipe the hard drive, walk back to the house, eat dinner, and pretend he never saw this. He could live the rest of his life in the comfortable ignorance he had enjoyed for 30 years. But George Strait was not a man who ran from the truth, no matter how much it hurt. This email wasn't just a digital file. It was a piece of Norma's soul that she had left behind. a testament to a love so fierce it was willing to suffer in solitary confinement to protect him. He needed to know the rest of the story. The email said she had a biopsy. It said Dr. Evans was worried, but obviously she hadn't died. She was here, so it must have been benign. But when did she find out? How long did she wait? Did she ever tell anyone? He stood up again, the joints in his knees popping. He needed to find the medical records. Norma was organized. She kept everything. There was a filing cabinet in the basement, a heavy metal thing that held tax returns from the 80s and medical files going back just as far. He had to know. He had to understand the timeline. He couldn't just walk into the kitchen and ask her, "Hey, did you think you were dying in 1995? It would break her to know he found this. It would shatter the protective shell she had built around that time. He needed to understand the full scope of what happened before he could face her. He turned off the monitor, leaving the computer tower humming. He couldn't bring himself to shut it down yet, as if cutting the power would sever the connection to the woman who wrote that letter. He walked out of the storage room, closing the door softly behind him. The hallway of the ranch house was cool and dim. Photos lined the walls. George and Norma at the CMAs. George and Norma at the ranch. George and Norma with their son. He looked at a photo from Christmas 1995. They were standing in front of the tree. He was wearing a black cowboy hat, smiling broadly. Norma was wearing a red sweater. He leaned in close to the photo. Her smile, it didn't reach her eyes. He saw it now. There was a shadow there, a tightness around the corners of her mouth. She looked exhausted. She looked like a woman who had walked through fire and was still smelling the smoke. How many times had he looked at that photo and seen only holiday cheer? Memory is a tricky thing. It paints over the cracks. It smooths out the rough edges until everything looks perfect. But the email had stripped away the paint, revealing the raw, unvarnished wood beneath. He walked past the kitchen. He could hear the clatter of pans. The smell of frying onions and garlic wafted through the air. It was a smell of home, of safety. He paused in the doorway, staying in the shadows. Norma was there, standing by the stove. Her hair was gray now, cut shorter than it was in the 90s. She was humming a tune, something soft and unrecognizable. She moved with a grace that age hadn't stolen. She reached for the salt cellar, her movements practiced and efficient. George watched her with a new set of eyes. He didn't just see his wife. He saw a warrior. He saw a woman who had stood in front of a freight train and held up her hand to stop it just so he wouldn't hear the whistle. He felt a lump in his own throat, hard and painful. He wanted to rush in there, wrap his arms around her, and beg for forgiveness for a sin he didn't know he had committed. But he couldn't. Not yet. The emotion was too raw, too chaotic. He needed to put the pieces together. He needed to know the specific gravity of the burden she had carried. He turned away from the kitchen and headed towards the basement door. The stairs were steep, the wood unfinished. He descended into the cool, dry air of the lower level. This was where the history of the Straight family was archived. Not the gold records or the platinum albums. Those were in a display case in the office or at the museum. This was the real history. The tax audits, the property deeds, the vaccination records for the horses, and the medical files for the family. He pulled the string of the overhead bulb. The light swung, casting moving shadows against the rows of metal cabinets. He walked to the one labeled Medical/Insurance. The drawer squealed as he pulled it open. It was packed tight with manila folders. He fingered through the tabs. Dental, optometry, Bubba, George, Norma. He pulled Norma's file. It was thick. Decades of checkups, blood work, and routine visits. He carried it to a small workbench in the corner of the basement and sat on a stool. He opened the folder, his hands feeling clumsy. He flipped past the recent years, 2020, 2010, 2000. He went back through the layers of time. 1996, 1995. There were several papers from that year. A receipt for a flu shot in January, a dental cleaning in June, and then a cluster of documents from October. He found a report from San Antonio Pathology Associates. Date of service, October 12, 1995. 2 days before she wrote the email. Patient, Norma Straight. Referring physician, Dr. Evans. Procedure, fine needle aspiration, core biopsy. Site, right breast mass. George stared at the clinical words. They were cold, detached, scientific. But behind them was the woman in the waiting room, the woman crying in the corner, the fear that had driven her to write that letter. He read the clinical notes. Palpable mass, approx 2.5 centimeters. Firm, irregular borders. Suspicious for malignancy. Suspicious for malignancy. The words hit him like a physical blow. She had been told it looked like cancer. That's why she wrote the email. She didn't just think something was wrong. The doctor had told her it looked bad. She lived with that sentence hanging over her head while he was singing Unwound to thousands of screaming fans. He flipped the page to find the pathology result. He needed to see the date on the result. The email was dated October 14th. The biopsy was the 12th. The pathology report was stamped Final Report. The date at the bottom was October 19th, 1995. 5 days. She waited 5 days between writing that email and getting the answer. 5 days of waking up in the morning and thinking it might be her last year on Earth. 5 days of looking at her son and wondering if she would see him graduate. 5 days of silence. He read the diagnosis on the report. Diagnosis: fibroadenoma. Benign. Benign. George let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. The air rushed out of his lungs, leaving him lightheaded. It was benign. It was harmless. But she didn't know that on October 14th. When she wrote, "If I'm not here," she truly believed she might not be. The fear was real. The sacrifice was real. The outcome didn't change the bravery of the act. She had walked through the valley of the shadow of death, and she had done it without a flashlight because she didn't want the beam to distract him. He looked at the notes scribbled in the margins of the report in Norma's handwriting. Just one word, written in blue ink, circled twice. Safe. And below that, a date, Oct 20. She had received the news on October 20th. He checked his phone again. Where was he on October 20th? October 20, 1995. Birmingham, Alabama. He was still on the road. She had found out she was safe, and she still hadn't called to tell him about the scare. She had buried it. She had swallowed the trauma. Locked it away in this filing cabinet, and never spoke of it. Why? To save him the guilt? To keep the tour pure? To prevent him from worrying about what could have been? George felt a profound sense of unworthiness. He was the king. People treated him like royalty. But in the dim light of his basement, holding a 30-year-old pathology report, he realized he wasn't the king. He was just a man who had been protected by a queen who fought dragons in the dark so he could ride in the light. The weight of the revelation settled on his shoulders. The silence of the basement felt heavy with the ghosts of her fear. He looked at the papers spread out on the workbench. The draft email upstairs. The pathology report here. The timeline of his tour. It was a map of a hidden war. He knew he couldn't just put these papers back. He couldn't unknow this. The image of Norma in the kitchen, cooking dinner, had taken on a sacred quality. He needed to do something. But what? You can't fix the past. You can't go back to 1995 and hold her hand in that waiting room. You can't go back and cancel the show in Little Rock to be with her. The only thing he had was the present. The only thing he had was tonight. He carefully placed the documents back into the folder, but he kept the pathology report out. He folded it gently and placed it in his shirt pocket, right over his heart. He stood up, his knees stiff, and pulled the string to turn off the light. The darkness returned, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the knowledge of her love. He walked back up the stairs, the wood creaking under his weight. He emerged into the hallway. The smell of dinner was stronger now. He walked towards the kitchen. He stopped at the doorway again. Norma was setting the table. She placed a fork, a knife, a napkin. Simple acts, mundane acts. But to George, watching her now, every movement was a miracle. She was here. She had stayed. She had survived the fear and the silence, and she was still here, setting the table for him. He needed to wash his face. He needed to wash the dust of the storage room and the tears from his eyes before he faced her. He turned into the small powder room off the hall. He looked at himself in the mirror. He saw the lines on his face, the gray in his hair. He looked into his own eyes. "You had no idea," he whispered to his reflection. "You foolish, lucky man. You had no idea." He splashed cold water on his face. He dried it with a towel that smelled of lavender, Norma's touch again. He took a deep breath, straightening his posture. He was George Strait. He had walked onto stages in front of 100,000 people. He had ridden bucking horses. He had faced storms and droughts on the ranch. But walking into that kitchen felt like the most important thing he would ever do. He wasn't going to confront her. He wasn't going to demand answers. He was going to offer gratitude. But first, he had to compose himself. He had to bridge the gap between the man who found the email and the husband she expected to walk through the door for dinner. He stepped out of the bathroom and walked into the kitchen. Norma looked up, her smile warm and familiar. "There you are," she said. "I was about to call you. Dinner's ready. Were you in the storage room? You look like you've been wrestling with dust bunnies." George looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the young woman from 1995 hidden inside the graceful woman of today. He saw the strength in her jawline. He saw the love in her eyes that had endured silence and fear. "Yeah?" George said, his voice raspy. He cleared his throat. "Yeah, just clearing out some old junk. Found some old computers." "Did you throw them out?" she asked, turning back to the stove to serve the mashed potatoes. "Not yet," George said. He walked over to her. He stood behind her, close enough to smell her perfume. "Norma?" She paused, sensing the shift in his tone. It wasn't his casual, dinner-time voice. It was heavy. "What is it, George? Is everything okay?" He hesitated. The email burned in his mind. "If I'm not here." "Everything is fine," he said, but he reached out and placed his hand on her shoulder, squeezing gently. I lost track of time." She turned around, looking up at him with a puzzled expression. "You're acting strange. Did you find something in there? An old song you forgot?" George smiled, a sad, tender smile. Something like that. He knew he couldn't tell her yet, not while the potatoes were steaming and the radio was playing low in the background. This required more. This required the right moment. But the seed was planted. The journey of reconstruction had begun. He had the first piece of the puzzle, the email. He had the second, the medical report. But there was a third piece missing, her side of the story, her memory of those 5 days. And to get that, he would have to navigate the delicate path of opening a wound that had healed over 30 years ago. He sat down at the table. Norma sat opposite him. They bowed their heads to say grace, as they always did. "Lord," George began, his voice trembling slightly, "we thank you for this food. We thank you for this day." He paused. The silence stretched. Norma peeked one eye open. "And Lord, Thank you for the strength you give to those who carry burdens in silence. Thank you for keeping this family whole. Amen. Amen, Norma said, lifting her head slowly. She looked at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. She knew him too well. She knew that prayer wasn't standard. George, what's going on? Just grateful, honey, he said, picking up his fork. Just grateful to be here with you. But as he ate, the food tasted like ash. He knew he couldn't leave it at that. The email was a call from the past, a distress signal that had taken 30 years to arrive. And now that he had received it, he had to answer it. The silence in the kitchen was not the comfortable silence of 30 years of marriage. It was a thick, pressurized atmosphere that seemed to hum with the electricity of the unsaid. The only sounds were the scrape of silverware against china and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, a rhythmic reminder of time passing, of seconds turning into minutes, of years turning into decades. George pushed a forkful of mashed potatoes around his plate. He wasn't hungry. His stomach felt like it had been tied in a knot by a steer wrestler. Across from him, Norma ate with her usual composure, though he noticed she was watching him. She had that intuitive radar that wives develop, a sixth sense that could detect a shift in the barometric pressure of her husband's mood from a mile away. "The potatoes are good," George said, the words feeling hollow and inadequate. "They're the same potatoes I've made for 40 years, George," Norma replied softly, placing her fork down. She wiped the corner of her mouth with a napkin. "But you haven't taken a bite. You're staring at that wall like it's a teleprompter with bad news on it." George forced a chuckle, but it sounded dry, like boots crunching on gravel. "Just thinking, Norma. Just thinking about the past. You know how it is when you start digging through old boxes. You find things you forgot." Norma took a sip of her iced tea. The ice cubes clinked against the glass, a sharp sound in the quiet room. "What kind of things?" He looked at her. He looked at the woman who had been his anchor. He needed to test the waters. He couldn't just blurt out the truth about the email. He needed to see if the memory of that dark October lived as vividly in her mind as it now did in his. "I found an old itinerary," he lied, though it was a half-truth. "From '95, the Straight Out of the Box tour." He watched her eyes. For a fraction of a second, just a heartbeat, he saw a flicker. It wasn't fear exactly. It was a tightening. Her pupils seemed to contract, and her hand, resting on the table, stilled completely. It was the reaction of someone who hears a sudden noise in the dark. "'95, she repeated, her voice steady but lower than before. "That was a busy year, a long year." "I was looking at the dates," George continued, leaning forward slightly, his eyes locked on hers. "October. I was in Tulsa, Little Rock, Memphis. Do you remember that autumn?" Norma looked away. She looked out the window, where the darkness had fully claimed the ranch. Her reflection was ghosted in the glass. "I remember you were gone a lot," she said. "I remember the wind was bad that year. We lost that old oak tree by the barn in a storm." She was deflecting. She was talking about the weather, about trees. She wasn't talking about the lump. She wasn't talking about the biopsy. She wasn't talking about the 5 days of terror. "I felt disconnected," George said, choosing his words with agonizing care. "Looking at that schedule today, I realized how much I missed. I was just moving from town to town, singing the songs, shaking the hands. I called you, I know I did, but I don't remember what we talked about. It feels like I was on a different planet." Norma turned back to him. Her expression was unreadable, a mask of calm constructed over a foundation of steel. "You were doing your job, George. You were providing for us. You were building a legacy. You can't be in 2 places at once. I was here. I handled things here so you could be there. That's the deal we made. I handled things here." The phrase echoed in George's mind. It was such a simple sentence. It sounded like she meant she paid the bills and fed the horses, but he knew now what it really meant. I handled the cancer scare. I handled the fear of death. I handled the possibility of leaving you alone. You handled everything, George whispered. You always have. He couldn't sit there anymore. The guilt was rising in his throat like bile. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. I'm going to step out on the porch, get some air. Norma nodded, watching him go. Don't stay out too long, it's getting cold. George walked out through the back door, the screen door slamming shut behind him with a familiar thwack. He stepped onto the porch, the wooden planks creaking under his boots. This was his sanctuary. The ranch porch at sunset, and now in the deep twilight, was where he usually found peace. But tonight, there was no peace. The Texas sky was a vast, inverted bowl of obsidian, scattered with the diamond dust of stars. The Milky Way was a faint smear of light across the center. The air was crisp, smelling of dry grass and cooling earth. In the distance, a coyote howled, a lonely, mournful sound that shivered through the darkness. George walked to the railing and gripped it with both hands. The rough wood bit into his palms. He squeezed until his knuckles turned white. He looked out at the land he owned, the empire he had built. It all felt fragile. It all felt unearned. He closed his eyes and let his mind drift back to 1995. He needed to reconstruct the timeline. He needed to understand the man he was then, to judge him against the man he was now. 1995. He was 43 years old. He was at the height of his powers. The box set had just come out, 4 discs of hits. It was a celebration of his career. Everyone was telling him how great he was. The label executives, the radio DJs, the fans. King George. They put a crown on his head, and he had worn it. And while he was wearing that crown, his queen was preparing for a funeral. He remembered the phone call from Little Rock. He could hear it now, playing in his memory like an old cassette tape. Hey honey, how's it going? That was him, breezy, confident. It's fine, George, just quiet. Bubba's asleep. That was her. The show was wild tonight. You wouldn't believe the noise. My ears are still ringing. How's the weather down there? It's gray. It's been gray all week. He hadn't asked why it was gray. He hadn't asked about the tone of her voice. He had talked about himself. He had talked about the sound check. He had talked about the catering. He had been the center of his own universe, and she had been a satellite orbiting in the dark, sending out signals he was too self-absorbed to receive. He opened his eyes and looked at the stars. How could she do it? How could a human being possess that much control? To stare into the abyss of a cancer diagnosis, even a suspected one, and not scream for help? It went against every survival instinct. When you are hurt, you cry out. When you are scared, you reach for a hand. But Norma didn't. She had suppressed her survival instinct to protect his dream. She knew that if she told him, the tour would end. The momentum would break. He would come home, distracted and terrified. She valued his success and his peace of mind more than she valued her own emotional comfort. It was a love so profound, it was terrifying. It wasn't the love of pop songs. It wasn't check yes or no. It was a biblical love. A love that bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. And he felt small. He felt like a child standing in the shadow of a giant. He turned away from the railing and paced the length of the porch. He couldn't just leave it at the email. He needed more proof. He needed to see the days. He remembered he kept journals back then. Not diaries with feelings, but logbooks. He was meticulous about the business side of touring. He noted the gate receipts, the set lists, the band's pay. He walked back into the house, bypassing the kitchen, and headed straight for his office. The room was lined with gold records and guitars in glass cases. He ignored them. He went to the bookshelf behind his desk, where a row of leather-bound notebooks sat gathering dust. He pulled the one labeled 1995. He sat at his desk, turning on the green banker's lamp. The pool of light illuminated the pages covered in his own handwriting, sharper than, more angular. He flipped to October. October 12, 1995. Travel day to Tulsa. Bus engine trouble outside Dallas. Arrived late. Tired. October 13, 1995. Tulsa. Show went well. Sold out. Throat feels a little scratchy. Need to watch the AC on the bus. October 14, 1995. Little Rock. Barton Coliseum. Soundcheck was a mess. Feedback in the monitors. Yelled at the sound guy. Apologized later. Called Norma. She sounded tired. Must be the weather. October 15, 1995. Memphis. Elvis country. Always feel a ghost here. Good show. The crowd was loud. Thinking about adding Amarillo by morning to the encore. October 16, 1995. Day off in Nashville. Meetings with MCA. Discussing the next single. Dinner with Tony and the guys. Drank too much whiskey. October 19, 1995. Knoxville. Rain. Cold. Miss home. Called the ranch. No answer. Left a message. October 20, 1995. Birmingham. Norma called back. Said she was out running errands. Sounded better. Said she loves me. Miss her. Sounded better. George closed the book. The snap of the cover was loud in the quiet office. Sounded better. Because she was safe. Because she had walked through the fire and come out the other side, and he hadn't even smelled the smoke. He rested his forehead in his hands. The weight of the gratitude and the guilt was a physical pressure behind his eyes. He had lived a lie. A beautiful, comfortable lie. He thought they shared everything, but she had carried the heaviest load alone. He stayed in the office for a long time, just breathing, letting the reality settle into his bones. He looked at the gold record for the Straight Out of the Box album hanging on the wall. It gleamed under the lights. It represented millions of sales, millions of dollars. But now, when he looked at it, he didn't see success. He saw the price tag. He saw Norma in a waiting room. That platinum disc was bought with her silence. Finally, the grandfather clock chimed 10. The house was settling down. He knew Norma would be getting ready for bed. This was their routine, the winding down of the day. He stood up, his legs feeling heavy. He turned off the lamp, plunging the office into darkness. He walked down the hall to their bedroom. The door was ajar. Soft light spilled out. He pushed it open gently. Norma was sitting at her vanity table, brushing her hair. She was wearing a silk nightgown, the same shade of blue she had always favored. Her back was to him, but he could see her reflection in the mirror. The rhythmic motion of the brush was soothing, hypnotic. Brush, brush, brush. George stood in the doorway, watching her. He felt like an intruder in his own life. He felt like he was seeing a stranger, a holy figure disguised as his wife. She saw him in the mirror. She didn't stop brushing. "You were in the office a long time," she said softly. "Did you find what you were looking for?" George walked into the room. He sat on the edge of the bed, taking off his boots. One boot. Thud. Two boots. Thud. He placed them neatly side by side. "I was looking at the tour logs," he said, keeping his voice low, "reading my own handwriting. It's funny how you write things down, thinking they are important. Bus broke down, sound check was bad, and then years later, you realize none of that mattered." Norma put the brush down. She turned on the stool to face him. Her eyes were searching his face. She knew. Somewhere, deep down, she knew he was circling something. "It mattered at the time, George," she said. That was your life. That was our life. Was it? George asked. He looked up at her, his blue eyes filled with a sudden, intense vulnerability. Was it our life? Or was it just my life, and you were just holding up the scenery so I wouldn't see the cracks in the wall? Norma went still. The air in the room shifted. The temperature seemed to drop. What are you asking me, George? He wanted to say it. He wanted to pull the folded medical report from his pocket and lay it on the vanity. He wanted to say, I know about the tumor. I know about the biopsy. I know about the email. But he stopped himself. If he did that now, with the accusation in his voice, it would sound like he was angry. It would sound like a confrontation. And this couldn't be a confrontation. It had to be a veneration. He took a breath and changed course. He needed to undress the secret slowly, layer by layer. I just feel like I wasn't there for you, George said. In '95, I look back and I see myself on stages, smiling, waving, and I wonder where you were. I wonder if you were lonely. I wonder if you were scared of anything, and I was too busy singing Unwound to notice. Norma stood up. She walked over to the bed and sat beside him. She took his hand, his large, rough hand, in hers. Her skin was cool, soft. George, she said firmly, we have been married a long time. There are days when you carry me, and there are days when I carry you. That year was your time to fly. I knew that. I accepted that. I wasn't lonely. I was occupied. I had Bubba. I had the ranch. You had secrets, he whispered. It slipped out. He hadn't meant to say it, but the truth has a way of leaking through the cracks. Norma's grip on his hand tightened. She didn't pull away, but her posture stiffened. She looked at him, her eyes widening slightly. Everyone has secrets, George, small things, worries we don't share because they would only burden the people we love. Isn't that what love is? Sometimes love is keeping your mouth shut. Is it? George asked. He lifted her hand and kissed the knuckles. Or is love trusting the other person enough to let them carry the weight with you? If I gave you the weight, Norma said, her voice trembling for the first time, you would have dropped everything. You would have come home, and you would have resented it later. Or you would have worried yourself sick over something that might have turned out to be nothing. She was close. She was so close to admitting it. Something that might have turned out to be nothing. She was talking about the tumor. George looked deep into her eyes. He saw the fear from 30 years ago still lingering there, a shadow behind the iris. He saw the protective instinct that had driven her. She had treated him like a racehorse that couldn't be spooked before the big race. She had protected his focus, his art, his career, at the expense of her own sanity. I would never have resented you, George said, his voice thick with emotion. I would have resented the world, maybe, but never you. If you had called me, if you had told me you were in trouble, I would have walked from Little Rock to San Antonio if I had to. I know, Norma whispered. A tear escaped her eye and tracked down her cheek. I know you would have. And that's exactly why I couldn't tell you. The confession hung in the air between them. She hadn't said the word cancer, but she had admitted the motive. She had admitted the protection. George felt a surge of emotion so powerful it almost knocked the wind out of him. He pulled her into his arms. He held her tight, burying his face in her neck. He smelled the lavender, the soap, the scent of the woman who had been his silent guardian. I'm sorry, he murmured into her hair. I'm so sorry I didn't know. I'm so sorry I wasn't smart enough to hear it in your voice. Shh, Norma soothed him, stroking the back of his head as if he were the child. It's okay, George. It's over. It was a lifetime ago. We're here. We're okay. But George knew it wasn't just over. The past is never dead. It's not even past. That moment in 1995 was the foundation upon which their current peace was built. If that biopsy had gone the other way, if the word hadn't been benign, his entire life would have shattered. He would be a widower. The songs would have stopped. The ranch would be empty. He pulled back slightly to look at her face. He needed to tell her what he found. He needed to show her that he knew the specific depth of the valley she had walked through. But not in the bedroom. Not now, when they were both tired and emotional. He needed to do it in the light of day. Or perhaps he needed to take her back to the moment. "Norma," he said, wiping the tear from her cheek with his thumb. Tomorrow I want to show you something. Something I found in the computer." Norma froze again. She knew. She had to know. "The computer?" "The old one," George said. "The one in the storage room. There was a draft, a letter." Norma's face went pale. All the color drained from her cheeks. She pulled back from him, standing up from the bed. She wrapped her arms around herself, a defensive gesture. "You read it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I read it," George said gently. "And I found the report from Dr. Evans." Norma turned away from him. She walked to the window, staring out at the darkness. Her shoulders were shaking. The secret was out. The box was opened. The 30-year-old ghost was in the room with them. "I was going to delete it," she said, her voice breaking. "I meant to delete it 1,000 times, but I couldn't. It was proof that I was brave, just for a minute. I wanted to keep it as proof that I could be strong for you." "You were more than strong, Norma," George said, standing up and walking to her. He didn't touch her yet. He gave her space. "You were incredible, but it breaks my heart. It breaks my heart that you went through that terror alone." "I wasn't alone," she said, turning to face him, tears streaming down her face now. "I had you, even if you didn't know it. I listened to your songs. I played your records while I waited for the doctor to call. Your voice, it kept me company. You were saving me, George, even while I was protecting you." George felt the tears hot on his own face. This was the revelation. He thought he was the provider, the savior, the star. But she had used his own art as a lifeline while she shielded him from the storm. It was a circle of strength, unbroken, even in the silence. "I want to thank you," George said, his voice cracking. "But thank you doesn't seem like enough. It feels like a cheap word." "I don't need thanks," Norma said, wiping her eyes. "I just need you to understand. I did it because I love you, and I would do it again." "I know," George said, "and that scares the hell out of me." He reached out and took her hands again. They stood there in the dim light of the bedroom, the history of their marriage swirling around them. The silence was no longer oppressive. It was intimate. It was the silence of truth. But the story wasn't finished. There was one more act to play out. George realized that simply acknowledging the secret wasn't enough. He needed to honor it. He needed to reconsecrate their bond in light of this new truth. The dinner he had planned in his mind, the moment of deep understanding, it needed to happen, but it needed to be more than just a conversation. "Norma," he said, his voice regaining some of its steadiness. "Tomorrow night, I want to make dinner. Just us. No TV, no phones. I want to sit with you, and I want to hear the rest of it. I want to know about the 5 days. I want to know everything you hid. I want to carry it now, 30 years late. Let me carry it for a while." Norma looked at him, her eyes searching his. She saw the resolve in his face. She saw the cowboy who was ready to take the reins. She nodded slowly. "Okay." "George," she whispered. "Okay." They stood there for a moment longer, the weight of the past finally shared between them. Then George led her back to the bed. They lay down in the dark, side by side, holding hands. As George stared up at the ceiling, he listened to Norma's breathing settle into a rhythm. He thought about the email. If I'm not here. She was here. She was right here. And he swore to himself, in the quiet of the Texas night, that he would never, ever take her presence for granted again. He would never let the lights of the stage blind him to the shadows in her eyes. But as sleep began to claim him, a new thought occurred to him. He had read the email, he had seen the report, but he hadn't seen the reply. Not a literal reply, but the spiritual reply that needed to be written. He needed to write back to the Norma of 1995. He needed to close the loop. Tomorrow, before dinner, he would sit at that old computer, and he would write the response that she never received. The morning sun broke over the South Texas plains with a brilliance that seemed to mock the heaviness in George's heart. It was a sharp, clear light, illuminating the dust on the fence posts and the dew on the Bermuda grass. The ranch came alive with the usual sounds: the lowing of cattle, the rumble of a tractor in the distance, the chatter of birds in the live oaks. But for George Strait, the world had tilted on its axis. The landscape looked the same, but the man looking at it had changed. He spent the morning going through the motions of his daily routine. He checked the horses in the stables, running his hands over their flanks, checking their hooves. He spoke to the ranch hands, nodding at their reports about feed levels and fence repairs, but his voice was distant. His mind was not on the livestock. It was back in the storage room, trapped in the magnetic spin of an old hard drive. Around noon, when the house was quiet and Norma had gone into town for groceries, George returned to the back room. He approached the old computer like one approaches a shrine. He sat in the creaking chair and pressed the power button. The hum filled the room again, a time machine revving its engine. He opened the email client. He opened the drafts folder. There it was. Subject: If I'm not here when the tour ends. He read it one last time. He let the words sear into his consciousness. Then he clicked reply. It was a futile gesture, technically speaking. The email address didn't exist anymore. The server was long dead. But spiritually, it was the only thing that made sense. He needed to speak to the Norma of 1995. He needed to reach back through the decades and hold her hand in that terrified silence. His fingers, thick and calloused, hovered over the plastic keys. He began to type, slowly, hunting and pecking, the clack of the keyboard echoing in the small room. Dearest Norma, he typed, I am writing this from the future. I am writing this from a morning in 2024, where the sun is shining and you are safe. I read your letter. I finally read it. And I want to travel back to that dark room where you sat alone and tell you what I should have told you then. He paused, his throat tight. You are not a coward. You are the bravest woman I have ever known. You carried a mountain on your back so I wouldn't stumble over a stone. You looked at the possibility of the end and you chose to protect my beginning. I am sitting here, an old man now, looking at the life we built, and I realize that every brick of it, every song, every applause rests on the foundation of your strength. He wiped a hand across his eyes. I want you to know that the biopsy came back benign. You are going to live, Norma. You are going to watch Bubba grow up. You are going to see grandchildren. We are going to grow old together on this porch. You don't have to be scared anymore. And I promise you, for the rest of the time we have left, I will never make you carry a burden alone again. I will listen better. I will look closer. I love you, more than the music, more than the road, more than the breath in my lungs. Love, George. He stared at the screen. He didn't click send. There was nowhere to send it. Instead, he clicked Save. He saved his draft right next to hers. Two ghosts, 30 years apart, finally having the conversation they needed to have. He sat there for a long time, listening to the computer hum. Then he shut it down. The screen went black. The fan spun down into silence. It was done. The loop was closed. He left the storage room and walked to the kitchen. He had a dinner to prepare. George Strait was not known for his culinary skills. Norma was the undisputed queen of the kitchen. But he knew how to grill a steak. He took 2 thick ribeyes out of the refrigerator, seasoning them simply with salt and pepper. He wanted the meal to be elemental. Meat, fire, wine, bread. No distractions. He set the table in the dining room, not the kitchen nook where they usually ate. He laid out the good placemats, the heavy silverware, the crystal wine glasses. He found a couple of candles in the drawer, white tapers that hadn't been lit since last Christmas. He placed them in the center of the table. He went to his study and found a bottle of Cabernet he had been saving. It was a vintage from the 90s. Fitting. He uncorked it, letting the wine breathe, letting the aroma of dark berries and oak fill the room. When Norma returned from town, the sun was beginning to dip low again, casting that familiar amber glow across the ranch. She walked into the house carrying shopping bags and stopped dead in her tracks. She smelled the steak searing on the cast-iron skillet. She saw the dining room table set with candles. She heard music playing softly from the living room speakers, not one of his songs, but an old Merle Haggard tune, something about enduring love. Preserve the original language of the text. Wiping his hands on a towel. He was wearing a clean, button-down shirt, tucked in, his hair combed. "Leave the bags," he said gently. "I'll get them later." Norma looked at him, her eyes wide. She looked at the table, then back at him. "George, what is all this?" "I told you," he said, walking over to her and taking the bags from her hands, setting them on the floor. "I wanted to make dinner. I wanted us to talk." She looked nervous. The vulnerability from the night before was still there, just beneath the surface. "Is the steak burning?" "No," George smiled. "It's perfect. Go wash up. Pour yourself a glass of wine. I'll be ready in 5 minutes." Norma hesitated, then nodded. She walked down the hall, and George watched her go. He felt a fierce protectiveness swell in his chest. He returned to the stove, flipping the steaks. The sizzle was loud and aggressive, a stark contrast to the tenderness of the moment. 10 minutes later, they were seated at the dining room table. The candles flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The steaks were plated, steaming hot. The wine was poured, a deep, rich ruby in the candlelight. They ate in silence for a few minutes. It wasn't the tense silence of the previous night. It was a reverent silence. They were both aware that they were standing on holy ground. Finally, George put down his knife and fork. He took a sip of wine, then looked directly at his wife. "I wrote back," he said. Norma looked up, startled. "What?" "To the email," George said. "I went to the computer today. I wrote a reply. I couldn't send it, obviously, but I saved it, right next to yours. So now, in that old machine, we're talking to each other." Norma's eyes filled with tears. She put her hand to her mouth. "What did you say?" "I told you that you were brave," George said, his voice low and steady, the voice that had captivated millions, now directed at an audience of one. "And I told you that you were going to be okay. I told the 1995 Norma that she survived." Norma let out the shaky breath. "I didn't feel brave, George. I felt like I was drowning in the middle of a dry field." "Tell me," George said. He reached across the table, palm open. "Tell me about the 5 days. I need to know." Norma looked at his hand, then reached out and took it. Her fingers interlaced with his. She took a deep breath, and for the first time in 30 years, she let the memory speak. "The first day was the hardest," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "After the biopsy, Dr. Evans said it was suspicious. That word, it sounded like a judgment. I drove home, and the road was blurry. I kept thinking about the tour dates. I had the calendar on the fridge. You were in Tulsa. I almost picked up the phone a dozen times. I dialed the number once, but I hung up before it rang." George squeezed her hand. "Why?" "Because I knew you," she said, a sad smile touching her lips. "If I told you maybe, you would have come home. And if it turned out to be nothing, you would have lost that momentum. You were finally breaking through to the legend status, George. I couldn't be the anchor that dragged you down." "You were never an anchor," George said fiercely. "You were the sails." "The second day," she continued, ignoring his interruption, "I cleaned the house, scrubbed the floors on my hands and knees until they hurt. I needed to control something. If I couldn't control the cells in my body, I was going to control the dust in the hallway. I wrote letters to Bubba, in my head, telling him how to be a good man if I wasn't there." George felt a tear track down his own cheek. The image of her scrubbing floors to outrun the fear of death was heartbreaking. "The third day, that was the day I wrote the email," she said. "It was Saturday. You were in Little Rock. The house was so quiet. The wind was howling. I felt like the walls were closing in. I sat at that computer and I poured it all out because I thought if I died, I didn't want you to think I didn't love you enough to tell you. I wanted you to know I loved you enough to stay silent." "I know," George whispered. "I read it." "The fourth day was Sunday," she said. "I went to church. I sat in the back pew. I prayed. I didn't pray to live, George. I prayed that if I went, you would be okay, that you wouldn't let the ranch fall apart, that you would keep singing." George bowed his head. He felt unworthy of such devotion. He had been worried about feedback in his monitors while she was bargaining with God for his future. "And then the fifth day," she said, her voice lightening slightly. "Thursday. The call came. I was in the kitchen making lunch. The phone rang. I knew it was Dr. Evans. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped the spoon. He said, 'Norma, it's benign. It's a fibroadenoma. You're fine.'" "And you didn't call me," George said softly. "I couldn't," she said. "I sat on the floor and cried for an hour, just pure relief. And then I felt angry, not at you, at the situation, and I felt exhausted. If I called you then, I would have had to explain the crying. I would have had to tell you the whole story. And you were in Birmingham. You had a show. I decided to bury it. It was over. Why drag you through the mud when I was already clean?" George lifted her hand to his lips. He kissed her fingers one by one. "You held the fort," he said. The words from the premise came to him naturally, weighted with a new, profound meaning. "You held the fort against the darkest enemy there is." "I just did what a wife does," Norma said, though her voice was thick with emotion. "No," George shook his head. "You did what a warrior does. You took the hit. You stood in the gap." He looked around the dining room, at the life they had accumulated, the photos on the walls, the furniture, the very air they breathed. It was all bought with her courage. "I want you to know something, Norma," George said, his blue eyes locking onto hers. "I have won a lot of awards. I have sold a lot of records. People call me the king. But sitting here tonight, holding your hand, I know the truth. I'm just the singer. You're the song. You're the reason the melody holds together." Norma smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that erased the years of worry. "That's a good line, cowboy. You should put that in a song." Maybe I will, George chuckled, the tension finally breaking. But this one is just for us. He stood up and walked around the table. He extended his hand to her. Dance with me. Norma laughed, a wet, teary sound. Here? Without music? We don't need music, George said. We have the memory. She took his hand and stood up. George pulled her close, his arm going around her waist, pulling her flush against him. They stood in the flickering candlelight of the dining room, swaying gently to a rhythm only they could hear. It wasn't a waltz. It wasn't a two-step. It was a slow, steady embrace. George rested his chin on the top of her head. He closed his eyes and breathed her in. He thought about 1995. He thought about the tour bus, the crowds, the noise. And he thought about the silence of this house, where a woman waited for a phone call that would determine her fate. He realized that the greatest performance of his life hadn't happened on a stage in Houston or Cheyenne. It was happening right here, right now. It was the act of understanding. It was the act of accepting the gift she had given him 30 years ago, and finally, fully saying thank you. I love you, Norma, he whispered into the quiet room. I love you, George, she whispered back, her head resting against his chest, right over his heart. They swayed there for a long time, the candles burning low, the shadows lengthening. The email was still saved on the hard drive in the back room, a digital monument to a terrifying time. But it didn't have power over them anymore. It was no longer a secret. It was a shared scar. And like all scars, it proved that the wound had healed, and the skin that grew back was tougher than before. Outside, the Texas wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the live oaks, singing a song of endurance across the dark, vast plains. The ranch was quiet. The world was asleep. But inside the house, under the warm glow of the candlelight, George Strait held his wife, and for the first time in 30 years, he truly understood the weight of the world she had carried, and he held her tight enough to let her know she would never have to carry it alone again. The night deepened, wrapping the house in a blanket of stars, and the two figures in the dining room continued to dance, moving slowly, steadily into the rest of their lives.